So, hello everyone, my name is Beth Wakelin and I teach at Whitfield Aspen School. My class is for children with severe and complex ASD and therefore severe sensory needs. Before becoming a teacher, I did my occupational therapy training and have always had a special interest in sensory integration. There's not nearly enough time in 10 minutes to discuss sensory integration knowledge in detail, so I'll give you a brief overview of what it is, what it does, and why as teachers we need to be aware of it. We're really lucky that this is a growing research field and there's plenty of information out there and more coming out all the time for those who want to develop it further. So what is sensory integration? Sensory integration is the receiving of a sensory stimulus which is then registered and integrated into the brain system and then a response is created. It's a developmental process, so we're not born with fully functioning sensory systems. It develops as children develop. A 7-month-old baby will have a very different sensory system to a 7-year-old child. And so it all starts with our senses. We have the 5 that everybody knows about, which is vision, hearing, smell, taste and touch, which are also called your visual system, auditory system, olfactory system, gustatory system and tactile system. But what some people don't know is that there are actually 8 senses that we are currently aware of. And I say currently aware of because actually one of them has only been discovered relatively recently. So as well as the common 5, we've also got our proprioceptive sense, our vestibular sense and interoception. So proprioception is the feedback we receive all the time from our muscles, joints and ligaments, and it tells us where our body is in space, how much force to use and how to keep in the same position as needed. We need to know where our body is in order to use it effectively. Our vestibular sense is received originally in our inner ear and it tells us where our head is in space and it registers any lateral or rotational head movement. And then the last one is interoception, and this is sort of your internal body sense, so it's whether you need the toilet, whether you're hungry, whether you're thirsty, all that sort of thing. So that's an overview of what each sense is, but what does each actually do? So this is my lovely diagram. So receptors in whatever part of the body that sense is associated to, so the receptors in the inner ear for the vestibular sense, will register a sensory stimulus, will send a message to the brain. The brain will then, whatever part of the brain receives that message, will then send it to another part of the brain to be integrated with messages from other systems, and then it decides what to do with it. It could be that the brain then sends a message back down to the body to react, or it could not. So if it sent a message back down the nerve pathway, it could be something like, if it was from your vestibular system, it could be a response to put your hands out to block a fall, if there's been a dramatic change, or it could be that the brain decides to do nothing and it screens it out. So for example, the background noise of a washing machine in the auditory system, your brain would tell you that you don't need to know about that at that time. So our sensory systems allow us to orient to, adapt to and react to the environment, which is what our sensory systems are for. This could be quite passive, so a slight body adjustment, or it could be quite dramatic, so it could trigger a flight, fight or freeze response in relation to a perceived threat. And that's a really important point to remember, as if a child has sensory difficulties, what their sensory system perceives as a threat is not necessarily what we would see as a threat. All our sensory systems have to work together. They don't work in isolation. They all need to be integrated in the brain or the central nervous system in order to work. So just standing here right now, I'm using my proprioceptive, vestibular and tactile sensory systems, and they're all being integrated all the time. So my proprioceptive sense is registering where my body is, what position my joints are in, and telling me what postural adjustments I need to stay standing. My vestibular sense is telling me where my head is, and it's then feeding into my proprioceptive sense to keep me upright and stable. And my tactile system is doing the same thing. It's registering where my clothes are, where my feet are touching the floor, and it feeds all this in together to create an internal body map in my head. So as we need our sensory systems and sensory integration for basically all activities, it doesn't take much to realise how much we are actually asking of children and their sensory integration in school. We all need sensory integration to carry out all of our basic bodily functions, motor tasks and accessing the world around us. As I mentioned before, it also feeds into our emotional state to its ability to trigger a fight, flight or freeze response. if you just consider how a smell can bring back a memory, either good or bad, that will tell you enough about how the sensory systems impact on emotions, mood and memory. So the difficulties. So there are many basic and more complex forms of sensory integration difficulty, and nobody's expecting teachers to know about all of them. However, if you consider what we've just said about sensory systems and what they do, and then consider that a difficulty can impact the sensory integration process at any point on its journey. So if we go back to its journey, at any point during that journey, a child can have a difficulty. And if you start to look at it in that way, you might just see that behaviours, actions and difficulties in learning that suddenly become much clearer. If you just think of a typical school day, and now just think of 2 activities that child will have to complete in their day. Then think of what you've just heard about what sensory systems they need to use at each activity. So if you've got a difficulty in more than one sensory system, life just got quite a bit harder in school. So that's the phrase. Everyone will have heard the phrase, they are very sensory, but what does that even mean? People used to use it, I think, to refer to children who love messy play and love touching things, but sensory integration, as hopefully you're realising, is about so much more than that. So a very general view of sensory integration difficulties would be this. You can have difficulties in any of the sensory systems, so any one of those sensory systems. You can have them independently in one system, or you can have them in more than one system. There's a generalised group of difficulties known as reactivity, which include being oversensitive, hyperreactive, or undersensitive, hyporeactive to stimuli and the feedback linked to whichever sensory system the difficulty is in. To make it slightly more complex, you can be hyporeactive in one system and hyperreactive in another system, and you can also have fluctuating reactivity where it changes on an hour, day, weekly basis. So as an example, a child who was hyporeactive in their vestibular system would not necessarily register spinning and jumping and all those associated head movements in the same way as somebody without that difficulty. And therefore they may seek that sensation by seeking ways to get it in a very extreme way. So that could be constant rocking, spinning. They're the type of children that never get dizzy. Or they may just appear indifferent to it. So a good example was I was talking to a teacher not that long ago who wanted to attract a child's attention without disturbing the rest of the class. So she walked up behind him and she tapped him on the shoulder. Nothing. Tapped him again. Nothing. Tap, tap, tap. Nothing. So that child was just not getting any feedback from his tactile system. As soon as she said his name, he turned around. So he just was not registering that sensation. Sensory seeking is often the behaviour that teachers notice most in class. It tends to be the more challenging behaviour. And it's the behaviour from children who are not getting typical feedback from whichever sensory system. And so they seek it out in a more intense way. And that can happen in any of the systems. So a child who was hyperreactive, so the opposite to hyporeactive in their vestibular system, would be oversensitive in that system. So they would almost look the opposite to a child that was hypo. So they may be quite a fearful child, they'd lack confidence on the playground, they'd avoid any activity that takes their feet off the floor is the big one. They might move quite slowly and carefully. And again, it can be in any of the systems and it can be in different systems. So that's reactivity. Another pattern of sensory integration difficulties that everybody's heard of but not necessarily thought of in the relation to sensory integration is dyspraxia. And dyspraxia is actually one of the most common forms of sensory integration difficulties. It's so much more than difficulties with motor-based tasks, however that is a key component of it. There's more than one type of dyspraxia. Dyspraxia in general is linked to the proprioceptives and the tactile systems and to difficulties in integrating those systems within the brain. Children with dyspraxia therefore will find it difficult to organise themselves, so that's their own bodies as well as the environment around them. Learn new motor-based tasks. They can do it, but it takes them much more repetition and breaking down of a task than it would for other children. Emotionally, they can be quite insecure. They can find it difficult to give sustained attention. They can also be quite rigid. On the opposite end, they can also be sensory seekers because they're trying to get the feedback they need to organise their own bodies. There are lots of other patterns of sensory integration difficulties, which I won't go into now, but a really important fact to remember is can be comorbid with other conditions, autism being a key one, or it can come on its own, independent of any other condition. And a lot of the research out there at the moment is what causes sensory integration difficulties. So, as teachers, what should we be doing? Firstly, we need to be educating ourselves about sensory integration and sensory difficulties. We are really lucky that there's so much information out there at the moment. It's really accessible, there's loads online, there's loads of really good books. And we should be brave. I think people get scared by sensory integration and they get scared by sensory strategies, but once you actually start, it's really not scary at all. Nobody is asking teachers to do sensory integration therapy. That remains an OT's role, and OTs with specific training at that. But we can be putting in place strategies that help children access their environment like we would with any other difficulty. And strategies that children can begin to use and adapt themselves so that they can meet their own needs, which is always the end goal. So sensory circuits. So sensory circuits are now really common in schools, which is fabulous. They're not a be-all and end-all strategy, but they're a really good place to start if you're quite new to thinking about sensory integration. They're really structured, they're adaptable, they're good fun for children to do. And again, there's loads of information out there on how to get going. When you're thinking about children and thinking about whether they may have sensory integration difficulties, just watch them. Children innately do what they need to do in a sensory way. So if you watch a child for long enough in different situations with an idea of sensory integration, you may start to see where their difficulties lie. They might innately do what they need to do, but it's not always appropriate. So that's when it becomes up to us to find more appropriate ways for them to meet their needs. Think about dyspraxia and reactivity. Nobody's asking you to diagnose this, but if you can actually think about it, you can therefore think about strategies that could help. The environment. So once you have an idea of where the difficulty may be, start to look at the environment and see what you can adapt and change. It's always a really good port of call to go to first. So look at the stimuli in the environment for each sensory system and see if there's any changes that can be made there. Think about the expectations of the child in that environment. What are their expectations to move, not to move, to be touched, not to touch, to maintain attention, etc. So a good example of that would be if you looked at challenging behaviour on the playground and it was a child that was hitting out on the playground. Through simple observations on the playground, you actually begin to piece together that actually maybe they find touch really difficult because they're only hitting out when another child touches them. So the easiest intervention you can give is give that child access to a quieter space at playtimes so they can do more sedate activities with other children and therefore avoid the need to be touched and bumped on a busy playground. Therefore, the child's anxieties are much lower, the challenging behaviour is reduced, the child is able to make and maintain friendships and is in a much better state of mind to learn on return to the classroom. Just simple changes like that can make the world of difference to some children. There are so many other interventions that you can do. These are just a few examples of equipment that you can use. Look at the timetables. Is there room for manoeuvre for targeted breaks? And not just the old-fashioned movement breaks, but targeted movement aimed at giving children the sensory feedback that they need. You can have equipment-based intervention. For example, I think it's on the other one, ear defenders for children that may be reactive to certain sounds. TheraBands on chairs for children who are constantly seeking proprioceptive feedback. Alternative seating. There's loads of different alternative seatings. Yoga balls allow children to move to get appropriate feedback whilst they're sitting in the classroom. Sunglasses for children who may be visually reactive. Yoga's a fab one for proprioception, and you can do it as a whole class activity, which really helps. And there are so many more, it's sort of endless. And again, there's so much information out there on what you can use. Before we finish, I'm going to mention heavy work activities. Again, it's when you start to look at sensory integration, it's a phrase that comes up time and time again. Heavy work activities are activities that target the proprioceptive system, so the sort of joints and ligaments. And it's the most amazing system because it's fundamentally calming to use those strategies. If you think about swaddling a baby, it's that sort of thing. So you can use those activities not just for children who appear to be seeking proprioceptive feedback, but for children who are reactive or having difficulties within other systems too, because it helps calm the whole system down. It's really good as part of a sensory diet throughout the day. It reduces the emotional response, and you can use it just before key trigger points in the day to keep them nice and calm. And it's so easy to incorporate into a day-to-day routine. So finally, these interventions are no different from us giving a pencil grip, doing some fine motor intervention, self-help skills or fiddle toys, all of which teachers are confident to do. So why are we not confident to be trying things like this? Be brave, watch the children, talk to the children, start to look at behaviour with an idea of sensory integration as well as everything else, and you might just be surprised at what you find. And remember, it is doable. So this is my SEN classroom set up for a group session, and that's a mainstream Year 4 classroom. So you can do it wherever you are based. And that's it. Thank you.